this video, I am going to be modifying this front bumper cover from my Dodge Ram. The idea, I want to make it look just a little bit more custom, but also allow a little more air into the intercooler to help cool the charge from my turbos. And what I have in mind is to kind of follow the, what I think the manufacturer would have done had they had the goal of opening this up a little bit more. So I'm actually going to follow that line right there. I'm going to use a body saw. There's a lot of ways to do that, but that's what I chose to use. And then I'm just going to use a Sawzall with a kind of longer blade to get this part. Now I'll probably overcut this a little bit because I can always kind of sand that down pretty easily with an angle grinder and a roll lock. You don't want to get into more than you have to, because I actually want to use as much of this original curve as possible to recreate that shape. Okay, so I don't want to go too crazy with the saw. But anyways, that's how we'll start. Other goal of this project is, and I haven't fully committed to this yet, but probably what I'll end up doing is kind of supporting this a little bit, maybe with a strip of metal or otherwise, and then I can put a couple of these really great lights in the front. These are from Rigid. These are pretty pricey lights, but they are pretty nice looking too. So anyways, we'll see how that part goes, but at least we'll kind of open it up and make it look a little different. Also repair this small damage there in the process as well. Alright, so now I got this center section cut out, and one thing I'll point out as you saw me cutting, I was moving this along and making sure that I wasn't going to get my blade into the stand, which I have done similar mistakes many times in the past. So just be aware of what's underneath your project as you're cutting. But in any case, you can see how I have just a little bit left over here, and I did that on purpose, but I want to try to smooth that out so that way all I have left is this kind of more flat body panel, and then I'm going to try to recreate that so it looks like that piece was never removed, like the factory meant it to be this way. And then on here I'll go ahead and smooth that out. Again, I cut just a little extra, and then I'll try to smooth out that corner there. Now I'll get the edges with something like this, but honestly, lots of different ways you could do that, including just one thing I've done in the past is like a socket, like a socket for a ratchet, and just put adhesive sandpaper on that, and then use that curve to do that. But that'll make pretty fast work of that. And then on the bottom part, I'll use this just to make it as flat and smooth as possible. Okay, so we'll see where we get. All right, so we're moving right along. We have a pretty rough cut here, but closely approximating what I actually want. You can see here I tried to grind almost till I saw it getting into the paint and primer of the flat part that I wanted to keep there. All right, and then we'll try to recreate basically what would have been here had this never existed. So it looks like the factory meant it to be that way. And this part's Again, pretty smooth. You can see I moved to the DA, which is not a typical use of a DA, but what I wanted was a nice broad surface area so I keep this nice and smooth without kind of dips and valleys. The bigger the surface area, the flatter that's going to be. And since that's a completely flat line, something like that 8-inch DA actually worked pretty good, even though that's not really the intended purpose of that tool. But sometimes you got to be a little bit creative. Now, I guess I'll kind of give you an idea of what my vision is here, so you can kind of see how I really opened it up pretty well. I think it looks pretty nice. Now, don't be fooled. It can make you a little nervous to kind of cut into your body panels. But that said, try not to be too afraid to do that, because that's how you can be creative and come up with some sort of unique things that look a little bit different, and the reward can be pretty great sometimes. So, don't go too crazy, but at the same time, if you can be kind of creative and try things that are a little different. All right, so now I'm at the test fit phase to kind of see how it's going to look once it's on the vehicle, and see what kind of modifications I want to make to it to make it look factory, make it looks more seamless. Because you can see there are some kind of gaps there between the bumper cover and the intercooler now. This fits up there pretty good and supported by metal up there, so that actually may work really pretty well for those lights if I choose to do that. I did make a template for what I planned to make as that filler piece, but I'll end up having to modify it for this little bump here. So I'll make it go around there. But also probably will try to add something in to kind of fill in this gap here. So I'll sort out what the best way to do that is. But we're moving right along, and actually kind of like how it looks. I was really kind of going for almost what the SRT10 look is, where that area is quite a bit more open. All right, so now we're working on filling those gaps. And, honestly, I actually like it quite a bit just the way it is. But that said, to take it to the next level, we'll try to fill this in here. Now, there's my template there. I made that one out of construction paper. And construction paper works really great for flat templates. And you can save a lot of time and material if you do a good job with that. So I've kind of fit that up, and I'll end up transferring that over to probably plastic. It could use metal. Now, for this piece here, though, I don't just want a flat piece or anything like that. I don't have a piece of plastic laying around that's going to work, and I don't have a real good way of molding plastic into shape. So metal is just the best option for me. Aluminum would be acceptable, maybe even ideal, but that said, I'm just going to use 20 gauge steel because I do have a bunch of that laying around. Now, for a template for that is a little bit more challenging with paper, so I'm going to use a little bit of metal to make a template, and this is what I did. So I basically measured the width that I want, and I've come up with that, which is 29.5 inches, and I bent this to fit the contour here, and then the piece will actually go underneath the intercooler. It'll actually fit kind of like that, but it'll go all the way across. But what this does for me is several things. One, it shows me the shape that I want. It also, I can measure this whole distance here so I know how wide a piece of, or how deep of a piece of metal I want. Okay, so it'd be 29.5 by whatever that distance is. Now I do have, I could have just ended it here where the intercooler starts, but actually having a little bit of overlap makes it a little bit easier, and will keep that edge from rubbing on the intercooler. So then I can just have it, the edge of this piece terminate underneath the intercooler. So anyways, to give you the kind of contours, it look a little bit like that. And this is molded here to fit the back of this plastic panel, and I can use a panel bonding adhesive to adhere those two together, and that's part of the reason I didn't just stop it there, because this isn't metal to metal where I could just weld that, which would be really easy. You have to use panel bonding adhesive or some other adhesive, and you need surface area for that to work. Okay, there's no such thing as a butt weld with adhesive. It just won't work. You need a lap joint. Okay, so that's why I did it that way. And I'm not going to adhere it to the intercooler. It'll just sit underneath there, but I'll be able to mold that. It'll look like we'll see how the product looks, end product looks, but it should look like a cohesive panel that is kind of meant to be that way. So that's my goal of this project. But anyways, little templates like that can be really nice, and don't skimp on time in making your paper templates as well to move forward with more efficiency. There we are. All right, so in going through my kids' school supply list, I came across this little gem. These are flexible rulers, and they work really great for measuring the length of curvy pieces of metal like this. So watch this. So you basically just start there, and then this will conform that entire way, so you can get a really accurate length. So get something like that. I mean, they're a couple bucks. This thing works great. All right, so now I got my lines marked for my 2 cuts to be able to give me the panel that I'm looking for. And I'm going to use this shear here from Bailey. This is an awesome shear, but this is 20 gauge. 20 gauge is pretty easy to cut with a hand shear or even a bench mounted shear, which are much cheaper than this. But having this thing is by far the best tool to do this. And it gives me nice straight cuts, etc. So anyways, we'll start with this one here first. And there's a straight edge here to allow me to make sure my cuts are nice and square. So I want to hold that up against there, and I'd always recommend using the straight edge when you can help it. And then kind of just get up on here like this, and then a little jump like this. Super straight. You can see kind of following the white line that I had made. All right, so now cut this one here. I'll leave the longer portion this way. That way I have more length against my straight edge. So that should be pretty good. And it's good to hold it in place. Every once in a while, if you're cutting something too sort of irregular, not perfectly flat or really thick, sometimes you get bound up in there, but 20 gauge cuts really easily. Once again, you can see it follows my mark really well. So that's a nice cut. All right, so here I got my metal piece all laid out, and I again use that kind of flexible ruler to look at my template and measure how far to each transition, meaning how far to each bend. And then I mark those. And then I labeled, what part goes where, because you don't want to get halfway through this and realize you made a bend the wrong way, or you made a flat part curved, etc. So nice and well labeled and good to stay organized. So now next step is I'm going to try to make these areas curved, okay? And also bend these areas here. So you have to decide though which you do first. Now, if you're using a bending brake to make your bends, that usually will not accept the metal if it's already been curved. So we'll start by making our bends, and then we'll go ahead and make our curves. So this is the bending brake. I've had other videos on how to use this thing, and a vise would work as well, but again, having this tool, this is by far the best one. This is a magnetic bending brake. So let's see how this works and when it's being used. All right, so now I'm ready to make my bend. First thing is to make sure that your bend is oriented the correct way, because when this thing comes up, it's going to bend this part of the metal up. So you want to make sure that you're bending the correct direction. And then you line it up there. And it does have these tabs on the side that help you to make a more rounded bend or a more sharp bend. A 0 would be a very sharp bend, a 2 less sharp. I'm going to make it a little less sharp, so we'll make it a little bit more curved there. And then have that all lined up nice and straight. And then I can either hit the start button over here or the pedal over here. Make sure you don't have anything in the way to be pinched, because this thing is going to clamp down. So like that. Now we're clamped down, and I can now bring this up. There is degrees over here to tell me how far I'm bending. But I also have my template here, which is going to show me roughly how far I need to bend. So it would look like that. So you can always bend more. All right, so we'll start with that, and we'll see how it matches. We'll see how it matches with our template here. And that is getting pretty close to probably what we want. We'll just go just a little bit further. So I'm going to clamp down again. There we are, clamped. And if I wanted a little bit more round bend, I could do that by just doing individual little bends here and there, but meaning move this out a little bit more, bend a little bit more. We'll unclamp. Oh, almost. There we go. Hold that down and then it unclamps. All right, let me show you how I'm going to go about bending this piece of metal here. There are a number of different ways to do this, but this is a fairly straightforward way to do it with relatively simple tools, meaning just a couple vice grips, a hammer, and a piece of pipe. It's nice to have that pipe fixed in a bench vise though, so you don't have to have someone else kind of holding it or that kind of thing. But in any case, any way you can kind of fix that pipe would be nice. Now, this is 20 gauge metal, so I should be able to do some of this bending or curving just by hand, but also a hammer can be helpful, and if you needed to heat, just be careful with heat that you don't burn yourself. But anyways, we're gonna see how this goes here. So you can kind of just recreate that decently well there, like that. You can see it's starting to work on this side a little bit, but this side is a little bit better just because I have the vice grips literally inside of the pipe. This side wasn't quite as secure, but it doesn't bend real well in the middle because nothing's holding it down there. So in that area we got to use the hammer. Now when you're forming metal, my recommendation would be to not try to do too much at any one time. Just sort of work your way around. That way you don't get kinks and folds and things like that. Because you don't want abrupt transitions. But the radius of this pipe actually worked out to be pretty close to what I wanted. All right, now our panel's been formed using this relatively simple method. You can see how it looks here. I made two concave curves there. And, spend a little extra time kind of smoothing things out. You can use a hammer and a dolly like that, or you can continue to use that pipe to hammer down on any high spots. A few other tools that you can use that I'll just show you real quick on the shop here. One way to kind of smooth some of those areas out is to use an English wheel if you have that tool. That's right there. Or potentially a planishing hammer like that. So those will help you to kind of finish that product sometimes. But that said, you don't actually need that because we've come up with a pretty good panel just with the simple tools there. All right, so let's see where we're at with our panel here. We have two nice concave curves in there to really match what we want. But when you look at this here, this is also curved outward. So in order to be able to make that happen, we need to actually stretch this metal along here. Stretching there will bend it to match that, okay? So if I am to stretch it, that will bend it kind of convex, meaning it'll come out more in the middle. And or if it was the other way around, I'd have to shrink it, and then that would actually make it concave, or move it in towards the middle. So take this to the shop and we'll go ahead and stretch that a little bit to see if we can match that curve. And then once we do that, we'll be able to make our bend for here. All right, so my panel's sort of roughly shaped here with two kind of convex curves there. You can see as I do that stretching, it does actually deform the panel a little bit, especially since this isn't just a 90-degree bend in a piece of metal. This is multiple curves, so those panels don't always shrink and stretch super smoothly, and that's to be expected, but that's okay. We'll get our final bend in here, and then we'll be able to refine this shape once we're in once we know that things look like they're in the correct places, the correct proportion, everything lines up reasonably well. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to make a little softer bend on the back here, and I'm going to do that by doing 3 partial bends at a 1/4 inch apart, and I'll start at the closest one, and then I'll move back a little bit. Okay. All right, so here's that final bend. I take back what I said. When I did this, I had to actually go all the way into this curve, or to this inner line first, and then progress out, because otherwise you end up clamping down on the part you just bent. So anyways, what you end up getting though, if you do this a 1/4 inch apart, is you have reasonably soft bend there. Almost, I mean, when you feel with your hand, you can feel that there are some flat spots there, but by the eye, it's actually a pretty smooth bend. Okay, so let's go see what this looks like on the truck. All right, so there's what the rough product looks like. Now I'll have to kind of notch that out because you can see that holds it down just a little bit, the edges of the intercooler. But you can see that curve there matches up pretty nice. And once it comes up a little bit, it should actually match there reasonably well. I may have to change my curve just a little bit, but at least kind of proof of concept, it's starting to look right. All right, so now I gotta make those 2 relief cuts. I'm gonna do that with a cut-off wheel, kind of get it sort of approximated as close as possible, and then I'll use a little bit wider grinder wheel to kind of creep up on the shape a little bit better. All right, so templates are important, but even with the best of templates, sometimes you're going to fit things up and realize you want it just a little differently. So don't be afraid to make changes, modifications, as much as you can, to be able to get the best fitting product. So what I actually realized is I want this bend a little closer to this bend. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take this piece right here and I'll just hammer along there with the hammer on the anvil, and I'll flatten that back out, and then I'll bend it back the way I want it. Alright, so now I'm at the phase where the finished, or the product is looking pretty close to the template that I have here. You can see it fits pretty well, but you can also see there's some imperfections there from the stretching that we did earlier. And I also want to get this curve here just a little more uniform. So I'd like it to look smoother, a little more uniform, maybe a pinch more curve right in there. So let me show you how I'm going to go ahead and do that. Now, earlier when we did this, we used that pipe down there in the vise, but that's not going to work as well for this because this is now a compound curve, meaning it not just curves like this, but it also curves in and out too. So, because it's curving like that, but also curving like that. So that pipe will no longer really do the trick. So what I got these here from Eastwood. Now you can make these. This would just be like a pipe welded to a piece of metal, flat stock. And I put it in the middle so that way when you pound down on it, it's not going to go anywhere. It'll stick right there. And that will help you to form that without being quite as long as that pipe down there. Now a shorter pipe might do the trick as well, but anyways, these are good, and they even add that rounded edge too on the right here to help if you need that for shaping. So let's move forward. Alright, so I'd like to show the contrast between the side that I've spent some time using hammer and dolly, and use this because that recreates that one curve pretty well, and I've used this one, and sort of gentle progress, just small blows to the metal to help kind of shape it how you want to and smooth things out. And you can see how irregular and kind of non-smooth this side is after the metal work we've done. And then come over to this side, and you can see how much better this is. Much smoother, the transitions are pretty even. And I'll spend a little more time on this, and when it's all done, I'll use a disc wheel, kind of surface prep that, and by the time I add a thin layer of filler, it'll look like it was meant to be there. Now, it's certainly not a professional, so actually the point of me saying that is that if you kind of play around with this stuff, just get some hand tools, even kind of a sandbag like that, a few dollies, or even make your own dollies. Things don't have to be perfect, but your projects will evolve and become a lot better. But see, all right, so one thing I wanted to show is, so in the middle there, I wanted that part to be convex, meaning it comes out a little bit more in the middle than it does on the sides. You can see that curve. In doing that, I had to stretch that metal there. So then what happened is this top part, see, it's kind of wavy. And it's wavy there because effectively there's too much material, meaning it's trying to curve in on itself. So you can try and flatten that, but that can only get so far because, again, it's basically like there's too much material. It's flexing in on itself. So we can go ahead and use the shrinker. So again, that shrinking action there, it clamps and then brings together. I'll just do a few spots like that, and it should you don't need to go crazy, but just a few little areas. I'm just working a little bit at a time, kind of going different depths. And you can see that waviness is actually coming out of there now. See, it's quite, well, it's still a little wavy, but not bad. As we kind of work on that, it'll get less and less that way. All right, well, there's the semi-finished product there. You can see it actually fits reasonably well. I'll go ahead and smooth a few things out, but it looks pretty good. So it actually, I mean, it's pretty complex shape actually, because it does curve out like this to match that arc of the bumper cover, and then also curves in like that. So it can be a little frustrating sometimes as you're working with metal with complex shapes like that, because you change one thing, it alters another or two or more things sometimes. So just take your time. But like I said, I think it looks pretty good. It's nice and reasonably well lined up here. I'll use just a little bit of filler along here to help kind of ease that transition from one to the next. And these sheet metal screws are actually amazing for kind of holding things in place. Don't worry about drilling holes there. That can be filled in, no problem. But that said, I think it looks pretty good. All right, in this video I'm going to show how to cut some sheet metal with tin snips. Now, it is important to select the correct kind of metal, because if you go too thick, that's just going to be almost ineffective. So this is 20 gauge, which is about as thick as I would go if you really want to get any kind of complex shapes with the snips. 18 gauge is going to be pretty hard to get through, may even dull your tin snips. You might not even be able to actually get through it in some places, although you can do some straight lines with them on 18 gauge. 20 gauge, 22 gauge, those kinds of things, you can really start to utilize these with good result. So the first step, though, is actually to make yourself a good template. That's going to really improve your efficiency in terms of not wasting material and or time. So spend some time to make a good template. This is a little bit thicker than regular paper. It's basically construction paper, so it has a little bit of rigidity to it. Now, there are a number of different kinds of snips. You can see I do have a bit of a collection up here from Milwaukee, Craftsman, etc. But honestly, I probably use these ones the most. These are pretty versatile. These are Midwest, but these work well. They haven't dulled much over time. And you can see I've already got this piece cut out. But I'll show some kind of tips and tricks on how to do that on this piece. One thing you'll notice when I'm going on these inner surfaces here, that's about the most challenging parts that you can cut with tin snips. Straight lines are pretty easy, but this can be more challenging. When I go on those cuts, I'm going to be using primarily just the the tips, so maybe like the last centimeter of the tin snips. That way I can make that curve actually happen. If you go too far in, you're going to distort your metal. It's going to be hard to do that angle. So just kind of watch as I move through. So there's the finished product. Now I can go in and kind of smooth some of those areas out, which is perfectly fine because snips are good, but they're not perfect. And again, kind of key pieces as you're going on these kind of relief cuts like this, you want to use just the tips. But as you're going around an outer curve like this, you can start to get in more towards the apex of where those blades come together, and that can give you a little bit better result there. But overall works pretty well. There is some distortion, but that's fine. Just a hammer and dolly will smooth that out, no problem. All right, so now I'm at the kind of rough fitment stage here. I did mark off an area here. I'm going to modify a little bit. As you can kind of see, it comes above the level there. And I have these two panels that I made, one for each side to help kind of fill that gap there. And just like before, I'm going to use sheet metal screws to kind of hold those in place. And that way, when I take the bumper cover off, I can actually weld these pieces to this, and I'll know they're in the right spot. So I got that one with the sheet metal screw in there. And when you're doing these sheet metal screws, you want to be careful not to drill into yourself. So actually, I would just go in there with the drill, just mark, just start drilling so you can see the mark, and then drill when you're on something flat so you don't accidentally drill through to your finger. And then the other thing too is you want your drill bits just slightly smaller than the sheet metal screws themselves. So then I'll actually take a sheet metal screw and just start it in there, so that way when I'm holding it up to the panel, this part here will fit inside the hole. So let me show you that here. So see, I'm just getting it started just like that. So now when I'm putting those pieces together, this will fit right into there. And then you'll be able to feel when you're in the right spot. Okay? All right, so the other nice thing about using these sheet metal screws to fit things in place is you can actually use your hole that's existing as a reference if you know you need to change your positioning just a little bit. For example, looking at this, side to side I'm pretty good because I'll be able to fill that with a little bit of weld. But you can see I'm just down slightly from level there by about 1/8 of an inch. So now I can take that panel off and I can move my hole down on the panel 1/8 of an inch, and then that'll bring that panel up by the distance I need. So here's what I'm talking about. I wanted this panel to move up on there, so I actually drilled a second hole just below the initial one. So when I put that up there, I'll know it's going to be moved up by just that amount, and I circled so I know which is which. Alright, so now I'm going to fabricate the last piece of this project here, and that's to fill in the gap between here and there. The nice thing about doing that is then this whole entire fabricated piece can be welded together. It'll be one continuous piece. It'll be easier to affix it to here. And actually what I plan is, it'll be bonded to the bumper cover, but then I'll use some body molding adhesive tape to put it on the bottom of the intercooler. Because the thing you have to consider is this isn't just cosmetic. When you're traveling down the road at 70 miles an hour, that actually is going to experience quite a bit of force. If you don't believe me, put your hand out the window at 70 miles an hour. You can feel what that force is like. So if this isn't secured well, it'll just be moving around and vibrating, and potentially worse, just fall off. So I want to be careful about that. So I'm going to make a little template to make up that little difference there between there and there. And construction paper works well, but no need to be fancy. You can literally just take, cardboard from, like, this is pretty thin stuff here. That'll work perfect. All right, so when I'm making these templates, I actually try to overestimate the size of them, and then once I'm getting sort of close, I'll come in and I'll either use a marker or even my fingernail. You can kind of just scratch along sharp edges and it'll leave that imprint right in there. You can see that imprint's there pretty well. And then I'll just refine it until I have what I need. Alright, so now you can see my template matches pretty close to what I need. Now I can go transition that over to a piece of metal, and then I'll be able to remove the whole cover, weld all that together, finish it off. And by the way, I think I may move towards using the lights here. There's one of them looks like that's that. I'll actually mount it back further. I'll weld on some tabs, but I think they look pretty nice. Alright, so now I got the bumper cover off and I'm getting ready to tack it into place. I am going to do that while it's still attached or screwed on to the bumper cover. Now I'm going to have to be super careful to control my heat while I do that, but the reason I'm doing that is because if you take it apart, try to weld it together, you may lose your shape, and then when you go to actually reattach it to the bumper cover, it may not actually work. So the plus side is I know it's going to fit. Downside is I got to be super careful with heat production, which I'd have to be anyways, because even if I take this off, this 20 gauge metal, heat production will warp that, and you just got to be very cautious. Now, the technique I'll employ is to just use small tack weld, use a little compressed air, kind of blow that off. So you'll see that process. I do actually have a separate video on tips and tricks for heat control as well, but check that out later. In any case, though, it's coming together pretty well. Get this cleaned up a little extra. I'm going to work on that gap because in this case, when we're really trying to control heat production, you don't want gaps. You want to get it as close together as possible, even to the point where you take... that's just a little extra piece I'll use right in that little gap there. So sometimes you just have to use a little extra time. So that'll help minimize the heat production. As you're filling gaps, you're using wire to do that, and that is inevitably going to add to more heat. Okay. So be very, very, very cautious with heat production on these types of projects. You don't want to finish it up just to have everything warped and look crazy. All right, let's move on. All right, so here we've made some progress, and I'll show the kind of way that I went about preparing the metal. You could see a little bit in the video, but basically I like to smooth my welds out first with a 4.5-inch grinder with a grinding wheel, and then often I'll use a angle grinder with a roll lock. Actually, the smaller, the 1-inch one is a little bit better for some of the tighter areas, but this works pretty good as well. It's a 3-inch one. And then one of the more recent tools that I've obtained is this here. It has a nice, so this one's from Eastwood, but this is a belt file sander. So this thing works really well to kind of just, because it's not super aggressive, so just approximates that curve just a little bit better than I can do with a circular roll lock or that kind of thing. But anyways, it's really coming along here. Next step, I'll kind of smooth things out, prepare all my surfaces, and then we'll look to attach that panel that I fabricated to the bumper cover using some panel bonding adhesive. Okay. All right, so now I'm at the point where I can attach this metal fabricated piece to the original bumper cover, and I've gone ahead and prepared both of the surfaces. So the surfaces have to be roughed up pretty aggressively, like 40 to 100 grit, something to give it a nice surface area to, scratches added surface area to have that mechanical adhesion. So after that, get a good cleaning. I'll use lacquer thinner, some organic based solvent, usually do a pretty good job of that. And once both surfaces are nice and clean, bright metal, then you can go ahead and get that in place. And remember, I had sheet metal screws in place to hold it where I wanted it, so that'll help guide me in place, because you don't want to be necessarily screwing around with the panel in terms of alignment, etc. once you have the panel bonding adhesive. It does have a little bit of work time, but that said, you want to be organized and have everything the way you need it. All right. This is the system I'm using for panel bonding adhesive, but there are more simple systems with just like caulk type gun. Sometimes they do take special guns because there's a catalyst as well as an adhesive. I do have separate videos on how to use that. So let's move forward. All right, so now that piece is bonded, and it's a good idea to get screws or clamps off before it's completely set up. Otherwise, those screws are effectively one with the part. So I'm going to go ahead and take those out. Usually, a kind of good way to know whether it's ready to come out or not is if you can depress your fingernail into it, it's still a little squishy, but not completely gooey, then it's meaning sticking to your finger still when you touch it. That's a good time to take either screws or clamps off, or both. Now, after I'm done doing that, I'll get rid of as much of this adhesive as possible. I learned from experience that can actually bleed through the filler or paint or primer a little bit. So we want to get rid of as much of that as possible, unless it's actively adhering the panels together. And then go ahead and use a little bit of reinforced filler to fill in that gap. And then I got a little bit of kind of special bumper filler. It's nice and flexible. This stuff by SCM, Bumper Bite. So that's a nice flexible, kind of almost like glaze putty basically, but specifically designed for bumper covers and flexible things like that. All right, so I'm just about to put the second layer of filler on. I just want to point out a couple of things that are really important when you're putting filler on, or honestly paint or any other thing. Surface preparation is critical. So you have to have a nice rough surface. In addition, that surface has to be clean. So I was able to kind of get this smoothed out pretty well with a DA, but then there's also these areas in here that I'm not going to be able to get with the DA. And that is important to also prepare. You don't want to leave that nice and smooth and shiny. So get in there any way you can, whether, actually in some of those spots, I'll just use like a wire brush, like this, just to get some scratches in there. You can use handheld piece of paper, sandpaper. Again, in general, I don't recommend handheld sandpaper, but if you're literally just trying to rough up those inner areas that you can't access any other way, that's a perfect way to do it. Then a lacquer thinner, wax and grease remover, or something else to get that surface super clean before applying the filler. Now I'm at the point where I'm going to be able to prime the areas that I have modified. I'm not going to necessarily prime the entire bumper. I could do that, but most of the bumper cover's in pretty decent shape, so it really just needs to be scuffed and prepped and could be painted directly over. But any other parts that have filler or modifications really need a primer, especially metal surfaces. Okay. And the other benefit to using a primer is it actually acts as a guide coat. So that one there it's a gray primer, and when I put that on there, it's going to be quite a bit darker than the filler. I'll actually show you. Here's what that looks like on the hood. You can see it's darker. So then, if I have high or low spots, that will be highlighted there with that filler. So that actually helps me to know how good my end product will be before laying the base coat and clear coat on it. Now, as mentioned in the past, there are sanding blocks that you can use to try to get into these surfaces to try to create the curves you want, etc. But sometimes you don't have exactly what you want, so just go ahead and be creative. So I mean, this is just an older socket that I have with some sandpaper wrapped around it. Nice thing about sockets is you would literally have just about every diameter you'd ever want. So you can specifically tailor the diameter of that socket to here. And if you want to change that slightly, you can just wrap your sandpaper around a couple extra times. That'll give you slightly more diameter. And it just kind of gets in there real nice and gives what should be a very smooth and even surface, okay? In general, again, you don't want to use your hand. Your fingers are irregular surfaces and can cause kind of non-regular surface. So you want to have nice even transitions between things so that way there's no waviness. Nice shiny base coat with clear coat on it will show a lot of those imperfections if you're not cautious. So just go the extra mile. All right, so now that the primer's on, you can actually see how it, almost like after it's been coated with base coat and clear coat, it makes it nice and shiny, and you can actually see some of the surface irregularities, some of the areas I still have to work on, like in there and here. You actually see how with this plastic underneath here, if you're not careful, you can actually get some of those pieces standing up a little bit there. There, so we'll get that underway with some sanding. I'm just going to do a little 220 on here now. That'll just, it's a little more aggressive than you'd want on your final layer of primer, but I'll probably end up priming this at least once, maybe 2 more times. Because the other nice thing about primer is it actually acts as a very thin layer of filler almost, because it does fill some of the surface irregularities. Now I'm ready for the second coat of primer, and you can see how that first coat really helped kind of fill in some of those irregularities. You can see how I used relatively coarse grit to prepare that filler, and you can actually see the primer filling in those scratches. But primer is really invaluable. It again acts as a guide coat, so I can see some of the high spots that I had and kind of work on those, as well as filling in a lot of irregularities in a very even way that's very hard to do with filler. So we'll move on to our second coating after very thorough cleansing with a wax and grease remover. All right, so here it is primed for the second time, and you can see actually when the primer is wet is an especially good moment to sort of look at it, and looking in multiple different angles and lights, just to see how the surface looks, because this will give you a really good idea of what the end product is going to be. I can still see some of my really coarse grit through the primer, so I got a little more work to do, but in general, pretty happy with the way it is. Alright, so now that I'm getting pretty close to how I want it, I'm going to go ahead and smooth that out with some 400 grit. So I'm going from my 220 to 400 just to, because you can actually see, if I were to paint right over this, you can see some of the fine scratches there from the 220. So we'll refine this just a little bit. The bumper cover is now ready for paint, and there's been a number of applications of primer. Initially I thought I'd just do 1 or 2, and then call it a day. But I kept finding imperfections as I was doing that. Even one moment I did add a little bit of filler here because I noticed it wasn't quite smooth and it was more than I could account for with primer. So I used a little extra filler there. So my perspective is I'll shoot for perfection because invariably I'm going to screw something up at least a little bit, and if the goal is perfection, and the end result will at least be pretty good. And I'm pretty happy with this so far. Now, the finish here before moving on. So the surface, the previous finish that had not been primed is prepped with either scuff pad or 600 grit, and then the areas that have been primed I've prepped with 600 grit. Okay, and in general that's going to get you about where you want to be, so you're rough enough to have that surface area you need to get the mechanical adhesion you need between the primer and the base coat without having any scratches that you're going to see through there. So I think 600 grit's a pretty good balance of that. If you're using a DA, you could use a little less because the DA moves in very irregular patterns, so it hides those a little bit better. I mean, you could potentially go down to 400 or 500 grit, but in any case, I did this finishing by hand since it's so irregular, so I used 600. That would be my recommendation, although there are others out there. But I think it turned out pretty good. Happy to see how this is progressing and excited to see how the paint lays down on it. Alright, the bumper cover is all finished up, mounted on the truck. I think it looks really, really good. Very happy with everything and how it turned out. You can see how those fabricated pieces really help integrate it in with the rest of the truck. Really looks pretty seamless, almost like it was meant to be that way from the factory, which is what I was going for. And the intercooler protector, although it is a functional piece, actually kind of looks nice as well. Paint turned out really good. Anyways, overall super happy with this. Be tons more projects like this. Please feel free to leave tips, tricks, comments. Really appreciate all that. Even some constructive criticism is great. And also, please subscribe.